In this video, we conclude our discussion on Chapter 8, where last time we went over the consumption function. This time we will examine investment a bit more carefully by recalling firms, to then go over interest rates as well as autonomous investment, to then put the two together to construct the investment function, which will allow us to consider movements as well as shifts in the investment function and what that means in terms of changes in aggregate demand, from which we will conclude with a summary. Now, beginning with our preliminaries, in revisiting aggregate demand data, we determined to look at consumption as well as investment a bit more carefully. We also decided to look at government expenditures a bit more carefully, but to forego this discussion until we discuss policy in Unit 3 of the course, while with respect to net exports, we decided to forego looking at this account a bit more carefully altogether. Where thus far, we've looked at consumption a bit more carefully and developed the consumption function. Now we seek to repeat this process, but for investment. Where, in terms of investment, we know that this relates to inventories, equipment, as well as facilities used to produce goods and services with, and that investment pertains to firms, and in terms of these firms, we know that they use their resources of the factors of production in order to fulfill their wants of profits, in which firms will purchase factors of production to transform into goods and services, and firms will have a finite amount of factors of production to produce with, meaning that they can only produce a finite amount of goods and services as well. Which means that if firms want to produce more goods and services, they will need to expand their operations. Where to expand their operations, this means making purchases in terms of purchasing additional equipment, or purchasing additional facilities, or purchasing services to expand their existing facilities. Where overall, in terms of these purchases to expand their operations, one avenue that firms can turn to is borrowing, where they can borrow from institutions such as banks in order to acquire the necessary funds. So in terms of these purchases that firms are making in the product markets, that is investment, it will in part be determined by the cost to borrow, where this aspect of investment will be known as interest-dependent investment and may not be the whole story for investment. In that, although firms need to think about the expansion of their operations, they also need to think about their current operations in terms of the purchases made, in terms of their current inventories, and the maintenance of their equipment, where this aspect of investment will be independent of the cost to borrow and will be referred to as autonomous investment. So what this means is we have two components, just like we saw with the consumption function, and to proceed, we'll look at them individually, where we will start with interest-dependent investment. Now, with respect to interest-dependent investment, we mentioned that this would be related to the expansion of operations, where the expansion of operations would be dependent on the cost to borrow money, where the cost to borrow money will define the interest rate, which we will represent with lowercase r. And in terms of the going interest rate, should the cost to borrow increase, then that means there will be less incentive for firms to expand their operations, such that we would expect interest-dependent investment to decline, which means that we would expect investment to decline as a result. Furthermore, if the cost to borrow decreases, then there will be more incentive for firms to expand their operations, such that we would expect interest-dependent investment to increase, where with an increase in interest-dependent investment, we would expect investment to overall increase as well. So then what we have is that investment is negatively related to the going interest rate. So now, having gone through interest-dependent investment, let us now move on to autonomous investment, which we mentioned would be related to current operations, which means that it's independent of the interest rate. And in terms of autonomous investment, should it increase, then we will see an increase in investment, whereas should it decrease, we will see a decrease in investment. And in terms of what determines autonomous investment, it will depend on two factors, where the first factor is expectation on future sales, while the second factor will be innovations, where with respect to expectation on future sales, should firms expect sales to increase in the future, then that means in the current period they may make additional purchases in terms of having additional inventory on hand so that they can make additional sales in the future. So if there's an increase in expectation on future sales, autonomous investment will increase. This will then correspond to an increase in investment. Whereas with respect to innovations, should innovations be occurring in the industry for particular firms that they're operating in, then this will reduce the cost of current operations, where those savings can then be used on purchases for equipment as well as additional inventories, such that with innovations occurring, this would mean an increase in autonomous investment, which would mean an increase in investment as well. So, having considered interest-dependent investment as well as autonomous investment, we can then consider the two together and form the investment function, which will show us varying levels of investment given varying levels of the interest rate, which we'll represent with the equation below. R is equal to C minus DI, in which R is the interest rate, C is going to be autonomous investment, D is going to be the slope, and is going to be how responsive the interest rate is to changes in investment, and I is going to be the investment levels of firms. Where, although in our discussion we mentioned investment responding to interest rates, this is how we'll carry our interpretation. Traditionally, in terms of the investment function, it's mapped with interest rates as the dependent variable and investment as the independent variable, and this is how we'll graph it in this course as well. So with this in mind, we can also graphically represent this, as mentioned below, with our investment function, in which interest rates is going to be on the vertical axis, investment is on the horizontal axis, and we see we have a downward sloping curve, and this is going to be due to the negative relationship between the interest rate as well as with investment. So then, now having constructed our investment function, we now want to proceed by considering how movements as well as shifts in the investment function correspond to changes in aggregate demand, in which we will start with investment function movements, where we mentioned that investment here is going to be a function of the interest rate, where there's a negative relationship between the two, in that if interest rates decline, then interest-dependent investment will increase, which is represented with an increase in investment, where with investment increasing and it being pro-cyclical, this would then correspond to a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Now for the opposite case, should interest rates increase, then this would correspond to a decrease in interest-dependent investment, which would mean a decrease in investment, where with investment decreasing and being pro-cyclical, this would then translate into a decline in aggregate demand, which we'd represent with the leftward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Where to graphically convey this case of interest rates increasing, here we have our investment function, in which interest rates is going to be on the vertical axis, investment is going to be on the horizontal axis. We have our downward sloping investment function, and in terms of firms, they're currently at point A, investing a level of I naught at the going interest rate R naught. Now, should interest rates increase, then this would correspond to a upward movement on our vertical axis, and given that there's a negative relationship between interest rates and investment, this would then correspond to leftward movement in terms of investment, which would take us leftward and upward on our investment function to point B, in which we see I1 is the current level of investment now, which is a reduction compared to I naught, given that interest rates have gone from R naught and increased to R1. Now, with investment declining due to the interest rate increasing, since investment is pro-cyclical, this would then correspond to a decline in aggregate demand, where if we were to look at our ADAS model and solely focus on the aggregate demand curve, if the economy initially had the aggregate demand curve in blue here at point A, in which buying behavior corresponded to demanding a Y naught amount of real GDP at the price level P naught, well, with the decrease in investment, this corresponds to a leftward shift in aggregate demand to AD1 in purple, where holding the price level fixed, this then means leftward movement in terms of demand, in terms of agents in the economy are now demanding a Y1 amount of real GDP, which is a strict decrease compared to Y naught. So then now moving to investment function shifts. Should there be a change in autonomous investment due to a change in expectation on future sales or due to a change in innovations, this would lead to a left or rightward shift of the investment function corresponding to a decrease or increase in investment, leading to a change in aggregate demand as a result as well. Where if autonomous investment were to decrease due to a decrease in expectation on future sales or due to a reduction in innovations, then this would correspond to a decrease in investment, which would correspond to a leftward shift in aggregate demand. Whereas if autonomous investment were to increase due to an increase in expectation on future sales or an increase in innovations, then this would correspond to investment increasing. and this would lead to a rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve as well, where graphically conveying the case of autonomous investment increasing, let us say that we have an increase in expectation on future sales by firms. Well, we have our investment function as before, interest rates on the vertical axis, investment on the horizontal axis, downward sloping investment function. Firms are currently at point A investing an I0 amount of investment at the going interest rate R0, where if in the future they perceive to make additional sales, then in the current period they may expand the amount of inventories that they're holding, where this would translate to a rightward shift in the investment function, going from investment function to investment function 1 in purple. We're holding the interest rate fixed at R0. This then means rightward movement going from point A to point B. We're at the same interest rate R0 then. We see that investment has gone from I0 to I1, where I1 is strictly larger than I0. Where with this increase in investment, given that investment is pro-cyclical, this then means an increase in aggregate demand. Where with an increase in aggregate demand, this then corresponds to a rightward shift. Where to graphically convey this, turning to our AD-AS model and focusing on the AD curve only, if the economy was initially at the AD curve in blue, at point A in terms of agents were demanding a Y0 amount of real GDP at the going price level P0, should investment increase, then this would correspond to a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve to AD1 in purple. Where given this increase in investment and holding the price level fixed at P0, this then means rightward movement to point B, where agents in the economy are now demanding a Y1 amount of real GDP, which is a strict increase from before. So then, to summarize what we saw then, investment was reasoned to be based upon the interest rate in the form of interest-dependent investment as well as an autonomous component, such that if interest rates were to decrease, then this would correspond to an increase in investment, which would then correspond to an increase in aggregate demand, whereas if autonomous investment were to increase, then this would correspond to an increase in investment as well as an increase in aggregate demand. So then now having revisited consumption as well as investment, where we'll pick up next time is by starting our chapter in terms of developing the Phillips curve model.